Some stories don't hide in the dark. They wait for someone to turn toward them. I'm Mr. Bones, and this is the Night Tales Show. Tonight we're stepping into winter. Not the cozy version, not lights, warmth, or celebration, but the kind of winter that decides who survives and who doesn't. For centuries in Iceland, children were warned of a creature that came at Christmas, a massive black cat that stalked the snow and devoured those who failed to work hard enough before Yule. Most people called it folklore, a cautionary tale, a myth meant to scare children into obedience. But myths don't come from nowhere, and they don't last this long without doing some kind of work. Tonight, we're asking a different question. Not whether the Yule Cat is real, but what it allowed people to believe, ignore, and explain away. Because sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones in stories. They're the ones stories were built to protect. This is the Yule Cat killings. In Iceland, children were not warned about monsters under the bed. They were warned about something much worse. They were told that if they didn't work hard enough before Christmas, a massive black cat would come down from the mountains and eat them. Not scare them, not punish them, eat them. The adults didn't whisper this story. They didn't soften it either. They didn't laugh afterward. They spoke it plainly as fact. And when someone vanished during the long winter nights, when a child froze, when a farmhand didn't come back from the dark, no one asked any questions. They said, the Yule Cat got them. So tonight, we're not retelling a fairy tale. We're asking a question that folklore was designed to prevent. Was the Yule Cat just a myth? Or was it a way to explain away real deaths that no one wanted to confront? Alright, so to understand the Yule Cat, you first have to understand Iceland. Not the postcard version, but the historical one. For most of its history, Iceland was isolated in ways that are hard to imagine today. There were long winters, brutally cold, and they had limited resources. Entire communities were surviving on livestock, fishing, and, most importantly, wool production. Winter was not a season, it was rather a test. And from the 1600s through the late 1800s, Iceland experienced repeated famine cycles. Starvation wasn't rare, and child mortality was expected. Exposure deaths were common enough that they barely warranted any remark. There were no police departments, no forensic investigations. And when someone died in winter, the explanation did not need any proof. Rather, it needed acceptance, and folklore provided that acceptance. The Yule Cat was described as an enormous cat, larger than any animal, black as night, eyes glowing, and moving silently across snow-covered farmland during the Christmas season. The cat hunted those who had not received new clothes before Yule. Now, that detail matters. New clothes weren't about fashion, they were about survival. And if you received new clothes, it meant that you had worked. You contributed. You earned your place in society. And if you didn't, well, it meant that you were weak, lazy, sick, poor, maybe too young or too slow. The cat didn't punish children, it punished failure. And that was not superstition, it was enforcement. Christmas in historical Iceland was not gentle, it was a deadline. By Yule, wool had to be spun. Tasks had to be completed. Those who produced were rewarded with clothing, and those who didn't were marked. Children were told the cat would eat them, but adults understood something deeper. If you couldn't work, you didn't belong. And in a land where winter kills without mercy, that belief had consequences. In parish records, letters from clergy, and oral histories recorded centuries later, winter deaths are often described with chilling simplicity, not as accidents, not as illness, but as being taken away by a cat. People that were taken away were children, young laborers, the elderly, the sick, and the poor. Cause of death was rarely specified because it really didn't matter. Once the cat was blamed, the conversation ended. And here is the uncomfortable truth historians rarely dwell on. Folklore doesn't just explain fear, it redirects blame. So, for instance, if a child froze and no one failed them, the cat took them. If a worker collapsed, no one pushed too hard, the cat came too early. And if someone disappeared, no one neglected them, winter did what winter does. The Yule Cat didn't just frighten people, it protected the system, and systems always benefit from stories that erase accountability. In communities where survival depended on labor, questioning a death could threaten the entire structure. Was the child overworked? Was food withheld? Was shelter inadequate? Was someone abandoned because resources were thin? These are all questions that were dangerous. And the cat was safe. It was a monster that absorbs guilt better than truth ever could. So here's the question we have to ask ourselves, and carefully, honestly, and without accusation. Did some people die not because of a monster, but because it was convenient to let winter finish what neglect had started? You see, they faced all sorts of issues, including exposure, starvation, abandonment, forced labor beyond endurance, and these leave no clean evidence. They look like cold, they look like snow, and they look like fate. And fate doesn't go on trial. All right, so by the 19th century, the Yule Cat was firmly embedded in society. Parents didn't warn children about freezing, they warned them about being eaten. Farm owners didn't speak of exhaustion, they spoke of punishment. Religion also reinforced this. Culture protected it, and tradition repeated it. And generation after generation, everyone learned the same lesson. You either work or you disappear. If you go looking for a list of Yule Cat victims, you won't find one. There is no ledger titled, "I was killed by the cat." There was no confession, there were no trials, there was no formal accusations. But what you would find instead are gaps. Parish death records from rural Iceland, especially between the 17th and 19th centuries, are sparse. Names do appear, ages sometimes appear, but causes of death often do not. So you'll see phrases like lost in winter, or did not survive the cold, or simply passed before Yule. And occasionally, in oral histories recorded decades or even centuries later, you hear something different. You hear things like, the cat took them. Now, this phrase is not a medical phrase, it's not a legal phrase, but it is a cultural phrase. And culture decides what gets remembered and what gets quietly buried. All right, so to understand why the Yule Cat targeted children so often in the stories, you have to understand how early children worked. In historical Iceland, childhood was short. By the age of 6 or 7, children were expected to contribute. By 10, they were essential, and by 12, they were often treated as full laborers. Wool production was the backbone of survival. So spinning, carding, knitting, weaving, these were not optional tasks, they were life or death work. A child who could not keep up wasn't just slow, they were dangerous. One extra mouth meant less food for everyone, and winter was unforgiving up to inefficiency. So children were motivated with fear, not abstract fears, but specific fear. And that's where a big cat that's enough to swallow you whole comes into the picture. The Yule Cat wasn't presented as a possibility, it was presented as certainty. If you don't work, the cat's gonna come. Not might, it will come. And this language matters, because when a child hears the same threat year after year, and then someone actually does disappear, well, the story becomes confirmed in their minds. Fear turns into expectation, and expectation turns into silence. And that's where silence turns into normalization. Here's where the folklore becomes especially dangerous, because many winter deaths don't require violence. They require absence, absence of heat, absence of food, absence of shelter, absence of intervention. So a child that's sent outside too long in the winter, or a worker that's denied rest, or let's say an orphan that was placed with a family that already couldn't feed itself. No one had to strike anyone in these scenarios. Winter finished the work. And when the body was found, or not found, the explanation was already there. It was the cat. Orphans and children from impoverished families were often sent to work on farms. These children were vulnerable in every sense. They had no advocate. They had no family power. There was no social leverage. And if they failed, if they became sick, or let's say they started to slow down, they could disappear very easily. And when they disappeared, the story was already waiting. The cat took them, and because of the cat, there was no investigation that was required. Christianity did not erase the Yule Cat. It absorbed it. Sermons from the 18th century reference winter punishments, laziness as sin, and divine consequences for failure to contribute. The cat was sometimes reframed as an agent of moral judgment. Work hard, and you are rewarded. Fail, and you are consumed. This alignment between folklore and religion gave the story authority. When a priest referenced the cat metaphorically, it reinforced the lesson. When parents repeated it literally, it reinforced obedience. And when someone died, the lesson felt complete. This is where modern historians struggle, because there are no clean numbers. We do know that winter mortality was high, we know that child deaths spiked before Yule, and we know labor demands peaked in late autumn. But we don't know how many deaths were accidental, unavoidable, preventable, neglectful, or quietly accepted. The lack of data isn't accidental. No one wanted to count those deaths. Counting would imply responsibility. A monster does something very useful for a society under stress. It gives fear a shape. Instead of saying, "This land is brutal and we are failing," you might say that the cat is cruel. Instead of saying, "We push too hard," you say, "Well, winter is merciless." Instead of saying, "We chose survival over compassion," you say, "Well, that's just how things are." The Yule Cat becomes a pressure valve, and pressure valves save systems. Now, there are accounts recorded much later of children refusing to sleep, refusing to go outside, refusing to stop working out of genuine terror. Now, these kids, they weren't pretending. They believed in the Yule Cat, and belief changes behavior. A child who believes in the cat and that the cat is real may run into the snow and panic. A child who believes failure equals death may overwork themselves into collapse. A child who believes disappearance is punishment may not cry out for help. Fear itself becomes lethal. What we see by now is not a list of murders. Rather, we see something more complicated. We see a pattern of harsh winters, labor enforcement, vulnerable populations, moralized punishment, folklore explanations, and uninvestigated deaths. Now, does this lead us to a serial killer? No. But is it a system that allowed people to die and then explain them away? Now, that question is harder and much more uncomfortable. As the Yule Cat legend spread, it didn't remain abstract. Over time, it became geographic. Different regions told the story differently. In some valleys, the cat lived in the mountains. In others, it crept along the coast. Some said it came from abandoned barns. Others claimed it followed the smoke of homes where work had gone unfinished. What matters is not whether the cat existed, but that people began to expect it in certain places. And expectation changes behavior. If a child vanished near a specific hillside, people didn't search long. If a laborer failed to return from a known path, people nodded grimly. If someone disappeared near the Yule, the conclusion arrived before the body ever could. The cat had a territory, and territories are how stories began behaving like perpetrators. When folklorists finally began recording Icelandic oral histories in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they encountered a problem. The stories didn't sound like metaphors, they sounded literal. Elders described screams in the snow, tracks that ended suddenly, shadows near outbuildings, children who went quiet before disappearing. Modern scholars often soften these accounts, translating them as symbolic warnings. But symbols don't usually include details, timing, locations, repetition. And when the same kind of story appears again and again across communities, you have to ask yourself, are we hearing metaphor or memory shaped by fear? Now, up to this point, neglect explains a lot, but not everything. There are accounts, now they are rare, but persistent, that suggest that something was more deliberate at play. Stories of children locked out overnight in order to teach them a lesson. Stories of laborers that denied food until work was finished. Stories of the sick being left behind during winter moves. Stories of orphans being sent away and never spoken of again. These are not the fairy tales that we're used to. They are human decisions made under pressure. And when someone dies after such a decision, folklore becomes more than explanation. It becomes insulation. Violence doesn't always look like murder. Sometimes it looks like refusing shelter, or withholding food, sending someone out one last time, or turning away when help is asked for. In a modern court, some of these acts would be criminal. But in historical Iceland, they were survival calculus. The Yule Cat didn't need to kill anyone. People did that themselves, slowly, indirectly, and plausibly. And when the outcome was death, the cat absorbed the blame. Here is the most disturbing question that historians rarely entertain. Did anyone ever intentionally let someone die, knowing the Yule Cat would take care of the blame? Now, there is no written confession and no trial records, no explicit admission. But intent doesn't need paperwork to exist. If a community knows that winter will kill, folklore will explain, and no one will ask questions, then cruelty can hide inside normalcy. Not everyone did this, not most, but systems don't require mass participation to function. They require silence. Children didn't just fear the cat, they anticipated it. Some accounts describe children crying in advance of Yule. Others describe children refusing to eat or sleep. Some became frantic workers, terrified of slowing down. Others withdrew completely. Fear itself can kill, and a child who panics may run into a storm. A child who believes punishment is inevitable may stop resisting. A child who thinks that disappearance is deserved may not scream. The cat didn't need claws. It lived in the minds of the children. This leads us to the late 19th century, and Iceland began to change. They had better trade, improved housing. Modern governance was now a thing, and there were better public health efforts. The conditions that created the Yule Cat were fading, but the story remained. Now, why is that? Well, because even when a system no longer needs a monster, culture doesn't let go easily. The cat shifted roles. The cat shifted from being an enforcer to one of warning, to tradition, to a children's story. But traces of the original function remain. And that's why the cat still eats children in the story, not to frighten them, not punishing them, but consuming them completely. Because originally, disappearance was the point. Modern audiences would like to say that this was just a story, that it didn't mean it literally, and that it was symbolic. But symbolism doesn't usually align this neatly with social outcomes. The Yule Cat legend reinforced work or die, contribute or vanish, fail and be erased. That's not whimsical, that's structural. And structures don't appear by accident. So if we were to define a serial killer as someone who causes repeated deaths within a consistent framework, under a repeated justification, with victims sharing similar vulnerabilities, then the Yule Cat isn't a creature, it's a system. Now this system allows death to repeat, allows it without investigation and without accountability, and there are no names. There's no murder weapon, there's no knife, there's no blood. It's just cold, hunger, fear, and silence. So why does this story survive at Christmas? Because Christmas is when we tell ourselves stories about generosity, warmth, and care. But the Yule Cat is a reminder that winter traditions were once about survival and not comfort. The cat survives because it tells a truth we don't like. That celebration often rests on invisible suffering, that some people are sacrificed quietly so others can endure. The cat didn't just guard Christmas, it guarded the line between who mattered and who didn't. At this point in the story, it's tempting to ask the following question. Did the Yule Cat kill anyone? But that question assumes death always arrives with teeth, claws, or intent. History rarely works that cleanly. A better question might be this. Did the Yule Cat allow people to die? Because when you strip away the fur and glowing eyes, what remains is a system that decided quietly and repeatedly who was worth saving when winter closed in. And once that decision is made often enough, the outcome begins to look intentional, even if no one ever said so. Now, there are limits to the historical proof of the Yule Cat. There will never be a document that reads, "We let the cat take them." There will never be a trial transcript. There will never be forensic confirmation. Not because nothing happened, but because the conditions of the time ensured that nothing could be proven. Deaths happened outdoors, it was common. Bodies were lost under snow. Exposure erased evidence, and records were incomplete. Witnesses were usually family members, and family was about survival. Survival does not testify against itself, so historians are left with fragments, phrases, patterns, timing, repeated outcomes, and a story that appeared exactly where accountability disappeared. That doesn't make the story true, but it makes it necessary. Folklore often acts like a mirror, but sometimes it acts like a machine. The Yule Cat did more to frighten children, and it sorted people. Those who worked were safe, and those who failed were threatened. Those who vanished were explained, and it transformed labor into morality, productivity into worth, survival into obedience. And once a system ties morality to survival, death becomes easier to accept. Now, none of this was celebrated, and it wasn't desired, but it was expected. At this point, it's important to say this clearly, that most people in historical Iceland were not monsters. They were parents trying to keep children alive. They were farmers trying to survive winter. They were communities balancing scarcity against compassion. But systems don't require monsters to cause harm. They require pressure. And under enough pressure, people begin to normalize outcomes they would otherwise find unthinkable. The Yule Cat wasn't invented because people were cruel. It survived because people were desperate. So when does neglect become killing? This is the ethical edge we can't avoid. If a child is sent outside knowing the cold may kill them, is that an accident? If food is withheld to teach responsibility, is that discipline? If shelter is denied to preserve resources, is that necessity? If no one intervenes, is that fate? Or is there something else? Modern law struggles with these questions even now, and in the past, folklore answered them before courts ever could. The cat decided. At this point, the legend of the Yule Cat outlives the conditions of the time. By the time Iceland modernized, the Yule Cat no longer served a practical function. Child labor decreased, housing improved, food security increased, death became investigated, but the story remained. And why is that? Because folklore rarely disappears, it mutates over time. The cat became a playful cat. It even became ironic and marketable. But the original shape is still out there, a creature that consumes those who fail to keep up. And that should make us very uncomfortable, because it reminds us that some traditions are built on suffering we'd rather not examine. This is where we return to the question from the beginning of the show. Was the Yule Cat a killer? Not in the way that we define killers today. There, again, was no single hand, no repeating weapon, no hidden lair. But if we define killing as creating conditions where death is likely withholding aid, normalizing disappearance, erasing responsibility through story, then yes, the Yule Cat becomes something more disturbing than a monster. It becomes a mechanism, a way for society to survive winter by deciding who might not. You might be asking yourself, well, why does this story matter today? Because we still tell stories that justify suffering. We still blame systems instead of choices. We still moralize productivity. We still explain away preventable deaths as inevitability. We still let some people fall through cracks and then tell stories about why it had to happen. The Yule Cat didn't disappear. It changed costumes. And this is where we have to land tonight. The Yule Cat may never have walked the snow. It may never have had claws or eyes or even fur. But something did walk those winters. Hunger did. Cold did. Fear and silence did. And when people vanished, a story arrived to make the loss bearable. It wasn't comforting, it was bearable. And maybe the Yule Cat wasn't a killer, but maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was an excuse. Maybe it was a confession disguised as folklore. Or maybe it was all three. And maybe the most unsettling part of the story is not what people believed, but what they didn't question. And I'm your host, Mr. Bones. And this has been The Night Tales Show. Not every shadow has a source, and not every answer has a truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay in the Night Tales. Have a good night.